Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are plunging into one of the most intellectually uncompromising texts of the early 20th century. It's Chapman Cohen's 1921 treatise, Theism or Atheism, The Great Alternative.
Right.
And we're not looking for polite agreement or, philosophical compromise here. We are here to unpack an argument that just refuses to accept any middle ground at all.
And that refusal, that's really the mission statement of the entire work. Cohen's whole goal is to press home the point that the logical issue is strictly and only between theism and atheism.
Nothing in between.
Nothing. He looks at those intermediate positions, agnosticism, various spiritual philosophies, these vague absolutes, and he labels them outright. They are, in his view, nothing more than a concession to a desire for mental or social convenience.
Wow. Okay, so that is a highly provocative starting point.
Mm-hmm.
He's essentially accusing anyone who's looking for some kind of philosophical middle road of, intellectual cowardice, or at least social compromise.
Yes. Or just convenience. It's easier. And the initial hook he offers the reader is this idea that rejecting a deity isn't this great loss or a source of fear. It's actually a liberation. He writes that the fear of a world without God is as idle as a child's fear of the dark.
That's a powerful image. It's an invitation to stop operating on this inherited emotional fear and to start applying really rigorous logic.
And he doesn't just critique the conclusion of theists. He critiques the entire method of how the argument has been framed philosophically for centuries.
Right, let's unpack that. He contends that the whole question of God's existence only achieves this kind of respectability of philosophy when the concept is, and this is his phrase, beginning to lose caste in its proper home.
Its proper home being religion.
Being traditional religion, exactly.
Precisely. He sees this historical trend. When traditional inherited religious belief starts to crumble under the weight of, say, scientific and historical scrutiny, the proponents try to give it a new intellectual veneer.
They rebrand it.
They rebrand it. They try to transform the idea of God, a concept that he argues originated in very primitive belief, into something abstract and sophisticated. They're effectively disowning its true parentage.
So he sees these philosophical defenses of God not as genuine intellectual quests for truth, but as a kind of subterfuge.
Yes.
Trying to devise a respectable pedigree for an idea that, in his estimation, really began as a fear-driven historical blunder.
What's fascinating about that is his observation that the arguments for belief almost always follow the belief itself. They don't precede it.
Ah, okay, so people believed first.
People believed first, usually out of some kind of psychological or social necessity, and then the philosophers came along to justify what was already there. He labels these philosophical defenses artificial adornments, hung there specifically to impose on nearsighted or careless observers.
That really dictates the tone for the entire book, then. He's demanding absolute intellectual rigor. He's forcing you, the reader, to judge the idea of God purely on its origins and its logical consistency, not on whether it's useful or culturally accepted.
Exactly. It sets the stage for a forensic examination. If the foundation is shaky, no amount of intellectual architecture built on top of it can save it.
Okay, so let's jump straight into the first intellectual hurdle Cohen identifies.
Yeah.
This is in Chapter 1, The Fundamental Problem of Definition. He argues that in these debates, the word God is almost never defined clearly.
It's the ultimate moving target.
It allows the concept to shift depending on what logical pressure is being applied at any given moment.
It is the ultimate rubber band word. Cohen points out that God has connotations that range wildly, and sometimes they're used in the very same argument. It can be the aggressively man-like deity of the primitive savage who demands sacrifice and, favors one tribe over another.
All the way up to.
All the way up to the shadowy absolute of the theologizing metaphysician.
And the confusion that results from that is profound. He notes that one kind of God is set up in an argument, this philosophical abstraction that's basically immune to scientific critique. While another kind of God is believed in fact, a personal deity who can answer prayers and intervene in your life.
Yes, the philosophical argument becomes, as he puts it, a disguise. It's a disguise for the loss of genuine, vital, personal belief.
And we see this played out perfectly in his critique of contemporary figures from his time. People trying to bridge that gap between science and faith. He brings up Sir Oliver Lodge.
Right. Lodge was trying to make the deity respectable to scientific minds, so he argued for this all-encompassing God. His logic was basically whatever worthy attributes belong to man-like intelligence, consciousness, personality must also belong to the deity, which he called the all.
And that sounds intuitively satisfying, doesn't it? If you're looking for
Very.
a cosmic purpose, it makes sense. If man is worthy, then the source of man must be supremely worthy.
It does, but Cohen just immediately applies his rigor to it. He asks the obvious but really necessary question: why must the deity be limited only to worthy attributes?
Right.
If worthy attributes like honesty and kindness and intelligence exist in the universe and in the all,
Then so do the unworthy ones.
then unworthy attributes like dishonesty, cruelty, and stupidity must also exist. They are all phenomenal attributes of this all.
You can't just cherry pick the good stuff. If the deity is the totality, it has to include the bad with the good.
Exactly. And when he was pressed on this logical extension, Lodge actually conceded the point. He said, yes, the bad attributes were also present, but he claimed they were dying out.
Ah, and that's the opening Cohen needed.
That is the fundamental theological surrender. Cohen just seizes on this. If the bad parts of the deity are decaying or diminishing, that means the deity is undergoing a process of change, of education. It means the deity is fundamentally subject to the law of growth.
And a changing, evolving God ceases to be God in any traditional sense.
Of course.
If God is subject to change, he's part of the cosmic process, not the unmoving, absolute controller who stands outside of it.
If God is learning, if he is subject to evolution, then he is a phenomenon, not a noumenon. He's conditioned, not unconditioned. And at that point, the entire edifice of classical theism, which relies on an immutable, eternal being, it just collapses.
Which brings us right back to the essential nature of the God that religion actually requires, which is a person. The second you lose that eternal, unchanging, all-powerful figure, you lose the figure people are actually praying to.
Yes. The religious impulse is directed at a specific entity. And the source quotes, "It's a wonderfully blunt observation. No man can love a pure abstraction. He might as reasonably fall in love with a triangle or profess devotion to the equator."
I love that quote.
It's fantastic. The God of actual worship has to have thoughts, feelings, the capacity to act on human affairs, all attributes of a finite, mutable person.
So the theologian is trapped in an impossible bind.
Completely.
They argue philosophically for an infinite, unconditioned absolute to satisfy the intellect, but then they preach religiously about a finite personal God to satisfy the heart.
And this is where Cohen deploys this devastating critique from the philosopher F.H. Bradley, who calls those who try to maintain this dual identity intellectually dishonest.
That is a serious charge. What specifically is Bradley accusing the theologians of doing?
He says the intellectual dishonesty is in trying to confuse the two concepts. Bradley notes that the arguments for the absolute are essentially, he calls them mere subterfuges, used to buttress the older, vital conception of a personal God. The deity they want, the one they argue for on Sundays, is finite, a person much like themselves, with thoughts and feelings limited and mutable in the process of time.
But the deity they prove.
But the deity they prove with their philosophical arguments is an impersonal, indifferent absolute.
So the whole philosophical defense becomes a shell game. What's proved is not what is asked for, and what is asked for is not what is proved.
Exactly. The moment you strip away the personality and the man-like attributes to make God philosophically sound, the God of religion just evaporates. And what you're left with is an abstraction that modern science already covers as force or energy or the totality of existence, which makes the term God entirely useless.
So Cohen's goal in this chapter is achieved. He's shown that theism can't hold this middle ground between a primitive, personal deity, which he thinks science and anthropology refute, and a modern, abstract deity.
Which is indistinguishable from atheism's concept of eternal energy. There's no space left.
Okay, so if the intellectual definition of God fails, where does the belief actually come from? Cohen turns in section 2 to what he calls the decisive blow from anthropology. He argues that our modern knowledge concerning the origin of the God idea should be decisive in judging its current validity.
It's a simple but powerful argument. If you trace an idea back to a fundamental error, no amount of subsequent intellectual polishing can convert that error into a truth. This is a crucial pivot point in the book. He's moving from abstract logic to historical and psychological evidence.
Right, and the first, most intuitive claim he addresses is the argument from universality.
Yes.
The idea that the widespread nature of beliefs implies its truth. This sounds compelling, when you think about deep shared human experiences across cultures.
It does, but Cohen refutes it beautifully with a simple historical analogy. The universal belief that the Earth was flat. For centuries, across completely disparate cultures, human perception led to a uniform but totally false conclusion. So universality, therefore, only proves one thing: that if primitive human minds are everywhere exposed to the same primitive conditions, the same stimuli, they will universally react in the same way.
Leading to a uniform, widespread, yet false inference.
Exactly. It's an inference based on uniform ignorance, not uniform knowledge.
That makes complete sense. And what about the historical track record of the idea itself?
Well, he notes the historical tendency toward the decay and the attenuation of the God idea. Primitive man had definite geographically limited, highly active gods. He had gods of rivers, gods of thunder, gods of war, very specific job descriptions.
Right. The historical process of social development has been to narrow that belief, restrict the deity's authority, and just make it increasingly vague over time.
It's a continuous retreat, and it culminates in the modern, indefinite God who, as Cohen puts it, means nothing and does nothing. The more we know, the less defined the deity becomes.
Which brings us back to his core anthropological argument.
Yes. If the God idea began in a huge blunder rooted in the ignorance of primitive man, you have to treat it like any other historically debunked idea.
Like witchcraft. This is the crucial analogy he really hammers home.
It is. When the observed facts that supported the belief in witchcraft, like strange illnesses or unexplainable events, were eventually explained by natural causes, pathology, meteorology, psychology.
The belief was just abandoned.
It was abandoned. It was not purified or advanced to a higher stage of spiritual insight. We just said, oh, that was wrong.
And he's just demanding intellectual consistency.
Yeah.
Why should the belief in God be treated on any other principle?
Exactly. If the grounds upon which primitive man constructed his theory of the world, the premises, are proven false by modern knowledge, we cannot logically keep the conclusion. If primitive man had known what we know today, Cohen asserts, the gods would never have been born.
And that leads him to detail the specific psychological and physical mechanism of that primitive blunder. He argues it's rooted in animism and the ghost theory, and he's drawing heavily on early ethnographers like Tyler and Fraser.
Yes, he lays out the mechanism. How does this specific blunder translate into the belief in spiritual beings? It begins with two sets of specific, common human experiences that are universal regardless of culture.
Okay, what are they?
The normal experience of dreaming and the abnormal experiences of, say, swoons, epilepsy, or unconsciousness.
For us today, we understand these as neurological events. But for the savage, without that knowledge, what's the conclusion?
For them, the dream is a real experience. If a man dreams he traveled to a distant land or spoke with a dead relative, then something must have escaped his body to have that experience and then returned.
And that something is the soul.
That immediately generates the concept of the soul, or the double. And once the soul is established as a logical mechanism to explain dreams, it is logically extended.
So if I have a soul, why doesn't my weapon have a soul? Or my food supply, or that massive tree in the forest? They must have a corresponding spirit, too.
Exactly. This extension covers animals, trees, and even inanimate objects. And that results in animism, this pervasive spirit world that's all around man. And the spirit world is typically hostile, or at least indifferent, so it demands constant propitiation. He highlights an observation from a Miss Kingsley about the West African, who must constantly appease the spirits of his weapons, the river, or the food he eats.
And how does that world of, millions of little spirits evolve into a single, unified, supreme deity?
The path, he argues, leads directly through ancestor worship. Fear and affection naturally focus on the spirits of deceased ancestors, particularly the distinguished ones, great warriors or the heads of powerful families.
You fear their wrath, but you also want their protective power on your side.
Right, so these specific, highly powerful ghosts are elevated through social and historical reverence, and they become the first proper deities.
It's an indisputable, historically documented process. He cites evidence from the mythologies of Greece and Rome, and even modern documented cases. He even mentions that curious instance of General Nicholson, who was apparently deified during his lifetime by some tribes in India.
It shows the mechanism in action. The crucial insight is that primitive gods are not independent creators. They are merely human ghosts with greater power, subject to human-like needs and emotions.
They are essentially super ancestors.
Yes, and Cohen suggests that even fundamental religious doctrines like death and resurrection can be traced to these primitive practices, like the documented practice of burying a human being to create a guardian spirit for a castle or a bridge, or annual human sacrifices to ensure crop fertility.
And so he concludes that the New Testament story is only a more recent version of a widespread savage superstition.
The origin for him, rooted in human ignorance and social mechanism, is decisive.
And that delivers the final blow from the field. He brings in Feuerbach's remark. Religion is ultimately anthropology, and it is anthropology that gives to all forms of theism the death blow.
Yes. Cohen sees the entire history of human knowledge as just systematically undermining the origin story of God.
So having demolished the God of religion based on its definition and its anthropological origin, Cohen then turns his attention in Section 3 to the intellectual battlefield of philosophy. He starts dismantling the classical proofs of theism, beginning with the argument from existence, the universe as this ultimate baffling fact.
Right. This argument basically says, the universe exists and we can't conceive of it being self-existent. Therefore, it must have been caused or created by a second necessary existence, God.
This sounds logical on the surface. I mean, if everything has a cause, the universe must have a first cause.
But Cohen immediately asks the critical question, what makes the introduction of God logically helpful? The impossibility of conceiving the universe as self-existent is not, he argues, lessened by introducing a second, even more unknown, possibly mythical existence, God.
Right. If existence requires a cause, then God's existence requires a cause. You haven't solved the problem. You've just added an extra, complicated, and entirely unverified layer to it.
It leads straight into an infinite regress. If the theist insists on a necessary cause for the universe, they have to insist on a necessary cause for God, and then a cause for that cause, and so on, ad infinitum.
It just increases the burden of explanation without enlarging comprehension one bit.
Exactly. And if the theist insists that God is the exception, that he's the uncaused existence, then why can't the universe itself be the uncaused existence? Why introduce an unnecessary variable?
That's the key.
And furthermore, if God is defined as a personality, we run straight back into the problem from Chapter 1. All known personality, human personality is derived. It's limited, it's mutable. We have no conception, no experience of a self-existent, uncaused personality. So to explain the known facts of the universe by introducing a cause, God, which contradicts all our knowledge of the required factors, personality, is, in Cohen's words, to forsake all intellectual sanity.
That's a very tight, decisive refutation of the existence argument. So let's move to the argument from order. This one often relies on probability and complexity. Cohen focuses on a Professor Flint's assertion that it's millions to one against the present arrangement of things occurring without a presiding mind.
Cohen calls that statement obtrusively false. And this goes back to the scientific understanding of forces and matter. Given matter and force with their inherent immutable properties, gravity, electromagnetism, chemistry, it is inconceivable that any arrangement other than the present one should have resulted.
Wait, that runs counter to our intuitive belief. We look at a beautiful seashell or a complex ecosystem and we think, this is so complex, therefore it must be improbable.
Cohen turns that right on its head. Complexity is not improbability. The present natural order is simply the necessary expression of nature's forces working themselves out over time. If you drop a stone, it must fall. The resulting order is merely the inevitable consequence of those fixed properties.
So the marvel isn't that the present order exists, because it couldn't exist any other way, but that any radical alteration to the known properties of matter should occur.
Exactly. Order, as the source notes W.H. Malik conceded, is a physical platitude, not a divine paradox.
And this argument is often just an appeal to ignorance, isn't it?
It is. If we don't know the exact chain of causation that led from a primitive nebula to a habitable world, the theist jumps in and says, aha, design. But Cohen argues that familiarity removes the wonder. If we fully understood the complex mathematics of molecular bonds, we wouldn't marvel that water is wet. It would just be the inevitable consequence of the forces at play.
Okay, so that addresses the classic sort of static argument for design. But what about the more modern update, the idea of directivity? The idea that even if the forces exist, a guiding hand is needed to keep the universe on its present track.
That's just the old argument wearing new clothes. It's still relying on the same intellectual gap. It's an appeal to human impotence. We do not know. We cannot see. But direction, or guidance, adds nothing to the actual qualities of existence.
Can you explain that a bit more clearly?
Sure. Unless the capacity for producing the universe already existed in the atoms and forces themselves, no amount of external direction could have created that capacity. Direction implies a choice between possibilities. But if the forces are fixed, as science asserts, the result is fixed. There's no choice to be made.
So if natural forces already possess the capacity to produce the universe on their own, then the argument for a deity just loses all its force.
Because everything you claim is due to God might just have happened without him anyway.
Right. So the final classical proof he tackles is the argument from causation. This frequently relies on the assertion that the cause must be similar to the effect. Like, how can that which has not life produce life?
This is what Cohen calls the fallacy of similarity. The theist argues that the cause must be similar to the effect, life must come from life, consciousness from consciousness. But Cohen says what they really mean is that the cause must be adequate to the effect. And science shows that similarity is often the opposite of what happens in causation. The scientific reality is that it is the essence of causation, that the combined factors produce entirely new qualities of which they show absolutely no trace when they're uncombined. He uses the example of sweetness in sugar of lead constituents. You can analyze the component chemicals all day long, but you will not find the quality of sweetness in any of them.
Sweetness only exists in the synthesis, in the combination.
Exactly. So expecting to find life or consciousness or design in the analysis of the elements that created them is absurd, because those qualities only exist in the synthesis.
And this leads to the second major problem with causation, the nature of the chain itself.
Yes. If cause and effect aren't two distinct things, but merely two aspects of the same thing, the combination of factors and the resulting phenomenon, then tracing the chain back can't reach a God who is distinct from the universe. God must either be the chain itself, or he must stand outside of it.
And if he stands outside, you run into this theological dilemma. A cause must consist of at least two factors combining to produce a result.
Precisely. If the theist reaches God as the single factor prior to the universe, he is left with God and nothing else. Since causation requires at least two factors to interact, the conditions for an act of creation or causation are completely lacking. God would remain eternally stuck at that first step, with no possibility of reaching anything else.
He also addresses applying the term first cause to an assumed substance or noumenon outside of phenomena. For the listener, can you just briefly clarify what those terms mean?
Certainly. In philosophical terms, the phenomenal world is the world of our experience, the world we can see, touch, and measure. The noumenal world, or the noumenon, is the world of ultimate reality, the thing in itself, which is supposed to be unknowable and transcendent.
Right.
Cohen points out that the term cause is entirely a phenomenal term. It describes relations between the phenomena we observe.
So applying the word cause to a transcendent noumenal reality makes the word totally meaningless. The concept of causation doesn't apply outside the observed universe.
Yes. The theist works back along the phenomenal chain, reaches a conceptual first cause, but because that first cause is defined as the transcendent reality, he has no intelligible way of getting back again to explain the phenomenal world we actually know.
He has jumped the fence between two realities and can't find the gate to get back.
He's trapped. The classical proofs are, for Cohen, fundamentally broken. So moving from these dense, abstract critiques, Cohen now focuses in Section 4 on the design argument, but this time he's dealing with the visible, tangible flaws of the world, its irrelevance, its disharmony, and the problem of pain.
And the argument from design is arguably the most intuitive one for most people. Kant called it the oldest, clearest one. Cohen starts by just dismantling Paley's famous watch analogy.
It's a very simple takedown. The only reason we believe a watch was made by an intelligence is our previous experience of watchmakers.
We've seen watches being made.
We have seen watches being made before. We have no experience whatsoever of world makers. The theist assumes design because he needs to, not because the evidence of the world itself compels him toward an external designer.
He then lays out this rigorous three-part test for what would constitute actual proof of design, which he claims is impossible to meet.
That's right. To actually prove design, you would need, first, certain proof that a god exists, which is what you're trying to prove.
Right, circular.
Second, knowledge of that deity's intention before the thing was created. And third, the ability to compare the final result with that known intention.
Since we can't possibly know the intention, and the existence is what's being argued for in the first place, the argument is useless as proof. You're just arguing in a circle.
Completely. And this forces the distinction between intended design and mere adaptation.
Adaptation, for him, is a universal quality of existence.
Yes. Cohen insists on this. Things always work together because, quite simply, they cannot do otherwise. A group of forces produces a result that perfectly corresponds to the combination of those forces. The fact that an eye is adapted to light is merely the necessary consequence of its evolutionary composition meeting the properties of light.
So the goodness or badness of the result is just in relation to a human-created ideal.
Precisely. A machine that fails in its intended purpose, say a crookedly built gun, is still perfectly adapted to shooting crookedly. The result is always the perfect expression of the forces that were combined. Cohen's startling conclusion from this is that non-adaptation simply does not exist. If we see a creature with flaws, that flaw is perfectly adapted to the forces that produced it.
This leads us to the grim realities of nature, the disharmonies that really undermine the idea of a single benevolent supreme mind. If God is one, the plan should exhibit unity. Instead, what we see is conflict, tremendous waste, and what looks to our human eyes like just bungling.
This is where Cohen's critique gains real emotional weight. He cites Theodore Roosevelt's powerful description of the Brazilian forests, full of insects that bite and prey. Roosevelt notes that nature is entirely ruthless, indifferent to good or evil, working out her ends or no ends with utter disregard of pain and woe.
So if we concede design, we have to concede a designer who intentionally created that ecosystem of constant, agonizing violence.
And the sheer waste is just staggering. Myriads of animals are born only to perish instantly. The tiger is perfectly designed to catch the gazelle.
But the gazelle is simultaneously designed to escape the tiger. It looks less like a harmonious plan and more like a massive, self-canceling war between warring powers.
And if we look at man, the supposed crown of creation, we find evidence of imperfect design everywhere, directly contradicting the idea of a careful, intentional creator.
Like what? What are some examples?
Well, our bodies are full of vestigial structures that actively encourage disease. The vermiform appendix, which is a major health risk, wisdom teeth, which often cause agonizing pain and misalignment, and body hair, which serves no protective purpose for us today.
These aren't signs of harmonious design. They're the scars of evolution.
Exactly. They demonstrate emergence from lower forms where those things were necessary at one stage but are now just hazards. If we judge nature from the standpoint of human intelligence and efficiency, it is full of waste and bungling.
And this, Cohen argues, means the problem of pain and evil is created entirely by the belief system itself.
Yes, if you dismiss the theory of a good and wise God, the problem just vanishes. But theists can't dismiss the problem, so they must try and justify the sheer brutality inherent in the evolutionary process.
His critique of evolution is one of the sharpest segments.
It is. Cohen points out that the evolutionary process relies on natural selection, which is fundamentally negative. It works by killing off the inferior types, not by positively creating superior ones, which is what any benevolent, competent designer or breeder would do.
The long, bloody process of trial and error itself is the logical sticking point.
Absolutely. He suggests that the claim that the long process itself is design, this wider teleology, is unadulterated stupidity.
Why?
Because if God wanted the higher type, why didn't he just produce it at once? It is unadulterated stupidity to take thousands of years securing what might have been as well done in the twinkling of an eye.
The long, murderous, wasteful process that involves infinite pain is entirely unjustified if the perfect result could have been achieved instantly by an omnipotent creator. The process itself is evidence of necessity, not design.
And finally, he addresses the common argument that pain serves a disciplinary or educational purpose. It builds character or teaches us lessons.
This is a classic theological explanation for suffering, yes.
Cohen dismantles it ruthlessly. First, the effect of pain is usually disaster and depression, not elevation or enlightenment. As Spencer noted, pain typically lowers the tide of life. Second, he presents that shocking paradox. A mother leaves her child by a fire, and the child dies by a hideously cruel death in order that a mother may learn a lesson in carefulness.
The implication is horrific. That level of causal cruelty, inflicting massive, fatal suffering on an innocent third party solely for the educational benefit of another, that's criminal in human terms.
Yes, yet it's attributed as goodness in God, and he emphasizes that nature, the physical world, provides no natural penalties for guilt. The consequences of actions are the same regardless of moral motivation. If you risk your life to save a drowning person and you get a severe cold, or if you risk your life committing a crime and get a severe cold, the physiological result is identical.
Nature is absolutely careless of moral quality.
The rewards and penalties have to be created and enforced by man because nature simply doesn't care.
After systematically dismantling the physical and philosophical proofs for theism, Cohen turns his attention in Section 5 to what he considers the modern intellectual retreats of his era. He starts with Herbert Spencer's unknowable and, more broadly, agnosticism.
Spencer's project was, politically and socially very appealing at the time. He sought to reconcile religion and science by defining the ultimate reality behind phenomena as the unknowable, this infinite and eternal energy that causes all phenomena but remains forever beyond human comprehension. And this was seen by many as a sophisticated modern philosophical basis for a deity.
So why does Cohen dismiss it so quickly as just meaningless?
Because it merely adds capital letters to what the materialist already affirms. The extreme materialist already says that phenomena result from eternal, inherent matter and force. Calling that force infinite and eternal energy doesn't introduce a new concept. It just makes the old one sound more mysterious.
And critically, if the ultimate reality is, as Spencer claimed, higher than personal, then it is, by definition, not personal.
Which means it serves absolutely no purpose for the theist who needs a personal God to worship or pray to or seek moral guidance from. The moment you remove personality, you have ceded ground entirely to impersonal natural forces.
The critique really hits hardest when Cohen questions the logical consistency of the unknowable itself, specifically related to the concept of causation.
Yes, remember our earlier discussion on the phenomenal and the noumenal? Spencer's entire theory rests on the unknowable being the cause of all phenomena. But Cohen reminds us that causation is a category of the phenomenal world. It's how we describe relations between things we experience.
Right.
If the ultimate reality is truly unconditioned and absolute a noumenon, it cannot logically be a cause because it sits outside the system of phenomenal relations.
So Spencer tried to use a phenomenal concept, cause, to define a noumenal reality, and in doing so, created a philosophical oxymoron.
And this allows Cohen to bring back Mr. Bradley's delightfully sarcastic assessment of Spencer's unknowable. He calls it a pleasantry. He says it's a proposal to take something for God simply and solely because we do not know what the devil it can be.
It's an intellectual placeholder for ignorance, not a basis for faith.
Exactly.
And that sets the stage for a broader critique of agnosticism. Agnosticism, defined by Huxley as simply being without knowledge, is criticized by Cohen not just for its intellectual fuzziness,
No, it's more than that.
but as a deliberate avoidance of the unpopular and unambiguous term, atheist, often due to social pressure.
He views it as a concession to social convenience. He asks the agnostic to define what he is ignorant of. If he rejects Zeus or Jupiter or the Jewish Yahweh, he is an atheist relative to those specific definitions. Philosophic atheism simply extends this denial to all defined gods.
And that refusal to take the final step is identified as an unequal development of the emotional and intellectual sides of their nature.
I think that's a key insight. They've allowed their intellect to tear down the arguments for God. But their emotional side, which has been conditioned by centuries of cultural habit and social expectation, holds on to a vague sense of reverence or mystery.
So the agnostic is clinging to a religious feeling after the intellectual support has been completely removed.
Cohen calls this the reverent agnostic, a transition form that is intellectually indefensible.
And the key intellectual flaw is the claim of suspended judgment. If God is defined in contradictory terms, like an infinite personality, which combines the absolute with the mutable one, can't logically suspend judgment.
No, you must deny its existence, just as you deny a geometric impossibility.
You don't say you are ignorant about the existence of a four-sided triangle.
You affirm that such a thing is logically impossible. Cohen argues that many theological definitions of God fall right into this category of logical impossibility. And if the agnostic asserts that God is unknowable, that statement itself is contradictory. You have to know enough about something to assert its permanent unknowableness.
So the only agnosticism that can justify itself, Cohen concludes, is the agnosticism that is actually indistinguishable from atheism.
So the final section turns from the intellectual defense of theism to the widespread fear about the practical consequences of unbelief, specifically the common anxiety that atheism would result in the collapse of morality.
And this fear is perhaps the biggest social barrier to atheism, even more than the philosophical challenges. Cohen just dismisses it immediately. He argues that morality is fundamentally social. It rests upon the conditions under which associated life is possible and profitable. It's based on facts about social survival, not on speculative beliefs about a deity.
The moral ought, that sense of duty or obligation we feel, is simply an idealized conscious form of the primitive tribal must. It developed because adherence to the group's rules was necessary for survival. You had to share, you had to cooperate, or the tribe failed. It's that simple.
So a change in religious belief can no more destroy morality than a change in government can destroy society. Because the underlying social facts, the need for cooperation, stability, and human welfare, they all remain constant.
Cohen even hits back at the moral claim. He suggests that, if anything, the accommodating nature of religion allows for all forms of rascality because it offers easy repentance, forgiveness, and salvation, which can often undermine genuine moral rigor.
Whereas the atheist, facing universal suspicion and persecution in 1921, provides a hostage to truth simply by professing such a wildly unpopular opinion. Cohen brings up Professor Tyndall, noting that the lives of those labeled atheists often contrast more than favorably with those who wield the religious brand.
And he includes this powerful testimonial from Coleridge, who said, "Not one man in 1,000 has either strength of mind or goodness of heart to be an atheist." And Cohen uses this to suggest that the fear that present believers are formed of poorer clay, meaning they would go wild without the threat of God, is actually a rather peculiar and weak defense for theism to make.
That leads us to the sweeping final argument in the text, the inevitability of atheism. Cohen posits that atheism is implicit in the growth of knowledge. It's the logical, unavoidable outcome of mental growth and scientific progress.
This is the historical arc of the retreat of the gods. The history of knowledge, he claims, is the history of the gods retreating from one department after another. Initially, God explained everything: weather, astronomy, disease, crops.
And then as we gained knowledge, God was kicked out of those fields. Astronomy explained the movements of the planets, geology explained the age of the Earth, biology and evolution explained the development of life.
And so the God idea is thus found only in the departments where our knowledge is currently the most efficient. The fundamental characteristic of the conception of God at all times is that it is the equivalent of ignorance.
Primitive man assumed gods because he didn't know the character of natural forces.
And modern arguments for God appeal only to what we currently don't know, explaining the beginnings of life or the origins of consciousness. God is always in the gaps.
And science, just to preserve its own constancy and predictability, is compelled to discard even the possibility of the existence of a controlling intelligence. You can't have uniform, calculable causation, which is the basis of all modern scientific work, and a self-determining deity who is capable of intervention. The two are mutually exclusive.
Right. The scientific calculation requires the assumption that the world operates on inviolable, non-conscious forces. Cohen sees the God idea as not growing or refining itself, but only attenuating. It just gets thinner and thinner until it stands for a little more than an abstract force, which again is indistinguishable from the forces affirmed by atheistic science.
So for him, the intellectual victory is complete. And the practical result, according to Cohen, is an enormous gain for humanity. He says it's an enormous concentration of energy upon purely human affairs and a judgment of conduct in terms of human happiness and prosperity.
Instead of wasting energy speculating on a fictional divine realm, we focus that energy, resources, and intellectual power entirely on solving human problems and maximizing human welfare here and now.
That was an incredibly detailed journey through a century-old text that remains, I think, fiercely relevant today. Cohen's thesis is unwavering. There is no logical middle ground. You have to choose theism, accepting its intellectual inconsistencies and its reliance on what he calls inherited anthropological blunders.
Or you choose atheism and embrace the logical implications of science and demand absolute intellectual consistency.
The text's lasting power really lies in its consistency, doesn't it?
I think so. It traced the belief in God back to its genesis, a huge blunder rooted in primitive ignorance, and then demanded that modern philosophy treat that initial error with the same rigor it would apply to the belief in witchcraft or a flat earth.
Refinement of an idea, no matter how clever, cannot convert a delusion into a demonstrable truth.
And the relentless dissection of the classical proofs' existence, order, causation showed that those philosophical supports either created infinite logical regress, committed fallacies of similarity, or simply proved that nature must, by its own definition, be ordered independent of any external designer.
It forces the listener, you, to confront the difference between psychological comfort and intellectual honesty. The agnostic position, though it's often touted as sophisticated, is here stripped down to an emotional transition state, avoiding the unambiguous term because of social fear rather than intellectual necessity.
He challenged readers to choose intellectual convenience or a logical conclusion.
To paraphrase Bacon, as Cohen often did, quote, "A little philosophy inclineth a man to belief in the gods, but depth in philosophy leads to their rejection as a false and useless hypothesis." If the gods are truly found out by anthropology and science, the intellectual challenge remains. How long can consistency tolerate a middle ground? The question for you, the learner, is where on this historical pilgrimage your own search for truth logically concludes.
And if atheism is truly, as Cohen claims, implicit in the growth of knowledge, the final provocative thought is this: if the entire history of science is the slow but inevitable retreat of the gods, what specific aspects of human ignorance today are we unknowingly using to shelter the next vanishing deity? Is it the origin of consciousness, the structure of the multiverse? What is the current philosophical placeholder for the unknown? Something to mull over. Thank you for diving deep with us.